And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
And each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is writer-director Michelle Garza Cervera. Her debut feature film, Huesera, The Bone Woman, is currently available on VOD. Welcome to the show!
Hi guys. Thanks so much for inviting me. Very excited to talk about this.
We're so excited too with both your movie. I've been dying to talk to you about this movie because it really affected me when I saw it back at, was it Fantasia? I think that I saw it at. And I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since. So thank you for joining us. Let's start off kind of talking about Huesera, though. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about it in case they have not seen it yet?
Of course. I'm so happy to know that you watched it in Fantasia because that was one of our highlight screenings, I think, because it was such a huge auditorium. And Huesera is my first feature. I'm based in Mexico City. This is where I'm from. I lived here all my life, and I did many short films before Huesera, all within the horror and the sci-fi genre. And this is my first feature, but I was cooking it since with some friends of mine, and especially with my co-writer Abia Castillo since 2017. It's a psychological horror that speaks about the moment of this woman that when she's becoming for the first time a mother, and this curse named La Huesera starts chasing her and her whole life throughout the process of her pregnancy. So that's a little bit of Huesera, the Bone Woman.
So one of the things that I see a lot of people have been, when they write about this movie, they talk about the themes of motherhood and kind of pregnancy horror. But the thing as a queer man that really attracted me to this was the way in which your film kind of, I would say, subverts the kind of thing that we typically see in horror or in movies where it's I'm rambling, but back when I was growing up in the 80s, a lot of times queer themes were subtext, and a lot of the movies that I grew up seeing, it was the queerness would enter the movie through subtext, and it would end up being destroyed by heteronormativity, like heterosexuality. And so as I'm watching this, and I'm watching this pregnancy horror kind of unfold, there's also this queer storyline that kind of reverts that, where it's she was kind of forced into heterosexuality, and by the end of the movie it's almost as, well, I don't want to spoil it, but it kind of, I just really dug how it sort of subverts that thing that I'm used to seeing in a lot of horror movies. And so I'm curious about the queer thematic part of that and how this story kind of came about.
Yes, thank you. I love your lecture, or the way you digest the film, because honestly, you're nailing it in the sense that I didn't want it to focus specifically in the motherhood aspect or the pregnancy aspect of it. I wanted to challenge the whole domesticity and the whole concept of path to happiness that we're sold and that we're almost forced to subscribe to. And I wanted to build a character that had subscribed to that whole path of life that everyone tells us, society tells you, this is gonna take you to happiness. Yeah. And I wanted to create a curse. The horror itself, I wanted that to torture that character in order to take her to the other side, which I don't want to spoil, but right. In the sense of her queerness, that in a sense that it's closeted, I wanted that to actually be a blanket for the character, because many times in horror, starting from characters as Frankenstein, when we see a broken character, we how do you say, what is on the other side? It's loneliness and kind of like a miserable, lonely life, no one to connect, no alternative, which is heartbreaking. And in a sense, I wanted to give that light, she has, it could have been this, A to B, but then I wanted, no, that's not how life is actually. And that's part of what is liberating of life, that we actually have a vast amount of options and dissidences of ways of living. And I wanted some characters that actually embrace queerness. That what I love of queerness is that it doesn't have to have a named path or like a
Right.
structure, and that's what is so liberating, and I wanted her to embrace that aspect, and I wanted these characters around her to give her that breathing or that freedom, which actually helped her give the strength to combat this curse that is breaking her apart.
Yeah, because like I think my favorite part of the movie is, and I'm not sure exactly at what point it happens. Like maybe the end of the first act. I'm not 100% sure, but we have like the setup of her marriage and her pregnancy, and then we get this flashback to kind of her punk roots, where she had like a pixie cut hairstyle, and she's around a lot of queer people, and there's that moment. There's a moment where she could leave all this behind and go with this woman that she obviously has feelings for, and she decides to stay and sort of embrace what I guess tradition or like what family has like taught her is the path for a woman. And so there's this moment where I'm like, wow, this is a lot more interesting than I was expecting going in with just a kind of a pregnancy horror movie.
Yeah, definitely. I wanted, actually, if you see the film, it's not that narratively that was a necessary scene. But for me, it's part of the point of making a film that also doesn't have to follow these rules of like A or B. Like
Hmm.
it's kind of like, no, actually we're plastic, or like, how do you, no, no plastic, elastic and transforming beings, and we have many aspects that cross our lives that formed us.
Hmm.
For her, this was something that was basic in her personality, or her identity. But yeah, like it comes with these concepts of growing up, or like the right path of like always sticking with your family, your blood family. All these concepts actually kind of like force us many times to take decisions that go against our own identities, or our own gut, or instincts.
Hmm.
And I wanted really, and I feel like that's what I love of horror, because that those feelings that are very hard to talk about, because you could have a character like living this kind of life, and having really no real motive, apparent motive, to be feeling like she's falling apart or breaking down. But then you can build an entity that represents those completely legitimate, validate, or not, to valid feelings, or
Hmm.
valid emotions. Like, that's what horror allows, because all that she's feeling is completely real for her, and it has to do with this identity loss that she submitted herself to in order to fool others' expectations,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Hmm.
Well,
And to me,
and
I grew up in the punk scene. I'm sorry. And
oh no.
I feels like that, right? Like, it feels like it's not about growing up. That I can't keep that forever, actually. It's not about age. Uh-huh.
Exactly. You're not going to age out of any. You're not going to age. It's not the joke. It's like it's not a phase, and people are like,
Hmm.
you'll grow out of it. But it's like, no. Like, what if this is a part of your identity and you grow into it more? Like, I don't think people talk enough about growing into something that you love and really embracing it, like you're talking about with like punk music and stuff like that.
Exactly. And of course, it transforms. But it has
Yeah.
to do maybe with, even like, punk is one of the paths, or like the ways to achieve that when you're young. But there's many ways to
Hmm.
achieve those kind of dissidences. I don't know if that's a word in English, but yeah,
Yeah.
like alternatives, I guess.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So you mentioned punk music. You grew up in the punk scene?
Yes, I did. Yes. I started, like, I don't know, like going to shows when I was like 14, 15.
Oh
And
fuck
then I played
yeah.
in different bands here in Mexico City.
Oh, really?
Yes. Actually, the song in the flashback is one of my bands.
Oh,
And
really? Oh my gosh,
yes,
that's awesome.
that's wild. But that's actually, I lived 1 year in London. I didn't mention that. And that year I had a band there called Forra. And there are three very close friends of mine. One of them, she lives in Argentina now, and the other one, they're from Spain. So we were four Spanish speaking friends. So that's why we decided to make a band that year. And that the name of that band is Forra. And we actually have a 7 inches out, like, through a very good records label in London, that is called La Vida es un Mus. And which is, for us, is like the best thing ever
That's so
that happened.
cool.
Yes,
What do
thank
you
you.
play?
In that band, I played guitar. The ones in Mexico, I used to be my first band, Especie Fallida. I was the lead. I was screaming.
Oh,
And
fuck
then
yeah.
yeah,
So
I love
cool.
yeah.
that. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, and then my other ones were guitar as well. So I only screamed in the first one, but I was very, how do you say in English, guttural, like demonic
Yes.
kind of screaming.
Yes.
Yeah, I can send you
Oh,
the links, of course.
please. That would be
Please
Yeah,
amazing.
do.
yeah, we have some like records out, like tapes and
Oh my
Bandcamp
God.
links. Yeah.
Michelle, that is so freaking cool.
Thank you
Are
so
you
much.
still in those? Are you still in the bands? Do you still play
Well,
music?
no, because honestly, my cinema is so jealous. Like I felt always guilty because I wasn't able to tour anymore or to practice every week. I'm still very close. Like they're still my best friends. Actually, the punk scene in the show, they're all my friends here.
Oh,
And
fuck yeah, cool.
yeah, that was all real. And I was actually dancing there with them. And yes, but I do play. I have my guitar here, and I use it more like a how do you say, like a relaxation
Hmm.
therapy, I guess, every day. Every time I'm very stressed with working, I sit down and play for a while. Yeah.
That's
That's
so cool.
amazing.
Oh my gosh, that
Well,
Thank
is
you.
so cool.
And I also loved this movie because I just got married. I'm a queer woman, but I'm married to a cis man, and this movie struck a chord because I am very very much getting the when are you having a baby? Like when are you getting pregnant? And I don't want to be a mom. I just have no it's just not for me. And this movie I'm getting goosebumps. Like it hits this thing of like not you're not a bad person for not wanting a kid. I think in a way that I makes me feel so incredibly seen as a queer woman who is in a straight passing relationship and like but doesn't want a kid and he doesn't either, and it's just like we don't get enough of this of like women just like not wanting kids and being pretty open about it, and it just feels so good to be seen that way in the genre. So like it's not really a question here, it's more like a thank you for like
I love
like
that.
watching it after getting married. And like my mom, every time I see her, she's like, so like have you changed your mind yet? I'm like, I saw you 2 weeks ago, like nothing has changed, like please stop asking me. And
Oh
it's
my God.
like it's so refreshing to kind of see that on screen now.
Well, thank you as well. It really, like, I really got in many comments after the screenings of like
Yeah.
people approaching saying thank you, and honestly, it was also for myself because I also it's very violent, right? Like there's like this like hidden agenda. Like I feel like it kind of like it's like if you're against human reproduction or something like that. Like it's like everyone is like, oh my, there's like a deep rooted concept or like that you're being selfish or that you're losing
Hmm.
something in life or that you're gonna be miserable and lonely and die alone, like there's very violent and scary concepts, and also that everything that comes with our reproduction years as women as well, like in the terms of like it feels like there's like a narrative that tells us that we have kind of like disposable
Yep.
they like how do you say, like when food
Like until
gets
we have like an expiration date.
Yep.
exactly that
That
we have
clock
an
Yeah.
is ticking.
expiration date. Yes, and that feel is like really it's a very terrible scary concept, and it has to do everything with becoming or not parents, and that's very scary.
Well, and it's
Yeah.
like I feel like my body at this point in my life, now that I am officially married to my partner, like I feel like people just see me as a baby machine. You know what I mean? Like you just are a vessel for children. And it is so frustrating when you're like, I have so many other things. And like, I'm not selfish for wanting to continue to travel and to work crazy hours and like do all this stuff. But
Yeah.
a lot of the time, like you are considered selfish for not wanting to like have a baby and go through the trauma of being like, and I think this movie also has just like the physical trauma of both being pregnant and having a baby. Like,
Yeah.
Jesus, Mary and Joseph. Anyway.
No, yeah, it's so normalized, right? Because we all come from a womb.
Yep.
Hmm.
So, but it's really attached with so much sacrifice from
Yeah.
like, yeah, there's so many aspects of our mothers. At least it happened to me when I started writing this project, that I started trying to see her as an individual separated from me, and just that exercise is hard to do. Like
Yeah.
try to understand everything that she had to hid or she kept away, or like was kind of like in her line time, like, yeah, in her past. Like there's a moment when a mother becomes a mom, and all those other aspects of her personality kind of like get like she's the only one that keeps that in mind, because it's kind
Hmm.
of selfish even to talk about, right? Like
Yeah.
it's very it's like a really a very vast and complex theme, and of course I took it to all the extremes because it's a horror film and I wanted that. But like also with so many of my friends that are parents or and specifically mothers, there's so many feelings and thoughts regarding those areas that
Hmm.
the films speak about, that it's also another closet. Like they have no safe space to speak about like how they feel, or like these moments where they just want to run away, and there should be like spaces also to speak about that. That's also normal. It's like it's a very hard thing to, I mean, to disarticulate, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, and Mary Beth, you had said kind of the horror of being pregnant, and so one thing that because I rewatched this movie to prep just to remind myself of the film, and what jumped out at me the second time is the sounds, like her bones, like when she's popping her knuckles, and just the sound design. I'm curious how you kind of approached making the sounds so icky
Yeah,
with
yeah.
like bones and stuff.
Like we were very happy on script with my co-writer that we found this particular characteristic of the character that has to do with her anxiety and when
Hmm.
everything that she's holding, that is like it comes with a sound, so that it makes it very cinematic.
Hmm.
And and it was very particular because it's something that is very kind of grounded that you can see around with people, but then we build a whole entity out of that. And I love films when they are very, when they build a sound world, or like the atmospheres out of the real world, out of
Hmm.
everything that could be that you could be hearing in your apartment, for example. Like, so we that was the rule with my sound designer. Like, we had to build everything in the film like the base was Valeria's surrounding. So her apartment, the domestic sounds, her street, her building, and then of course the bone aspect. So of course we could
Hmm.
distort it and transform it and make it super fleshy on moments, but always trying to keep it grounded, I guess,
Yeah.
to her reality. In order to say that this reality, this kind of in Spanish we have a word called like cotidiano, like this daily basis life that
Hmm.
kind of becomes like a habit, could be
Gotcha.
terrifying as well.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like I don't like bringing, like, for example, drone sounds or like otherworldly sound effects to my films. Like, I feel like reality is more than enough to make something terrifying, right? And or like a bone sound that could be the only thing sounding. And actually, the sound designer, what we recorded the most was actual people that they know how to break, like to crack their
Oh,
bones.
wow.
Like, he has a niece that she's a teenager, maybe 17, and oh my god, she's impressive. Like, she can crack every bone of her body. It's impressive. So we went,
Wow.
of course, from using like vegetables and like animal bones, but then at the end, because there's like the cover of the skin, so that is
Oh
kind of like
yeah.
it's not
It's
the same. You
muted.
need like there's exactly that's something that the skin does, that blocks the sound. So that's why we went back to use actual people.
I just cracked my
Yeah.
knuckle because now I'm like, wait, you're right. I was like, oh shit,
Oh
I
my
didn't
god,
think about
I
that.
love that. That's amazing. Oh man,
Wow, that's
yeah.
incredible. Well, so okay, so you've said all of the shorts that you've made and your feature now are all kind of in the genre realm. How did you get introduced to horror? Like, how old were you when you first saw a horror film?
So I grew up in a weird house. I like in the sense that both of my parents were like, they studied architecture and they were industrial designers, and they were very, how, I mean, kind of hippie,
Mm.
like weird, like in the best way, but they had very weird objects. Like, they had a lot of tendencies to imagination and like
Mm.
other worlds.
Okay.
I was very lucky in that sense, that I grew up in a house that it was very open to play and games, and every weekend going to the theater or like expositions
Oh, cool.
or cinema. So that I feel like that I was lucky in that sense because I had a whole sense that I could be creative, and that was not something special from me, because I feel like everyone could do it. Like my oldest brother, he's also a artist, a visual artist.
Okay.
So I think that really now I've been doing I've been reflecting about it, and I think that made me very, like, I was writing short stories since I was 10 or 11 years old,
Oh, cool.
and I had a lot of tendencies to fantasy, like of course, like we're I have with my best friend, like that we're friends since we were 5 year old. I wrote stories to her that she still keeps, and everything
Oh.
was very fantastic, like very weird, very crazy stories. And I feel like that I always kept that. And then when I found punk, I kind of started watching a lot of punk films. More than horror films, I would watch everything that was within punk, like kind of Rocky Horror Picture Show or
Mm.
Velvet
Okay.
Goldmine, or like
Oh,
all
yeah.
John Waters, of course, like all
Yeah.
kind of
Okay.
like queer slash punk world, like musical, like all that. I was obsessed. Like, of course, I was listening to David Bowie and Ryan Eno, and like I was all that like when I was a teenager. So that's what I grew up loving, and I feel like that was the moment I decided I wanted to become a film director. Since I was like 17, I was taking every class in school that had anything regarding video, and it was very I was kind of very I knew it. I never thought about something else. Like I immediately I finished high school, and I tried to get into film school, and I didn't pass, of course, the test. So I started working in short films of other people, like as a PA or as an art assistant
Mm.
and whatever. But I was very into punk, and when I got into film school, I was very rebellious, I guess. Like very like I hated the cinema language classes and all that, and I hated most of my classmates because they were all very like Bergman and Tarkovsky and like all that. Not that I hate those filmmakers, but
No, but
honestly,
But I
I
know
was like,
exactly who you're talking,
you
like the
know what
kind of
I
people
mean?
you're talking about.
Yes,
They look down on anything that's not those movies.
exactly.
I've
Oh
told
my,
this I've told this story before, but when I was in my 20s, I had taken I was interested in writing screenplays and whatnot, and I took a writing class. And of course, I'm coming from a very genre focused, like I love horror, and I wanted to write horror movies. And I got to this class, and my screenwriter instructor's looking at me, he's like, "Why don't you do like a boy and his dog story?" And I was like, "Why would I want to do that? I don't want to write about that." And they're like, why aren't you doing like a drama or like a comedy?" I'm like, because I have no
oh
desire
my.
to write that.
Yeah, because
But I
there
know
was
those
this
people.
whole idea that you're doing like something bad quality if you're into
Mm-hmm.
horror, right? So I kind of,
Exactly.
since I was like more in punk and all that, I actually embraced it. I was like, oh, you know what, I'm gonna do what everyone here is saying that is the worst thing. Like, because I felt
Hell yeah.
freedom. I felt like I was a weird one doing horror, so nobody was kind of really they didn't see me as a competition, because of course everyone in film school is very competitive, and I felt like I had my own thing, honestly. Like I had my own thing. And I
I mean,
love
that's so
that, and
punk
I felt,
too, right? Just sort of like saying, I'm not going to go down this path. I'm going to go down my own path. That's
yes,
punk.
I started like that, and then of course I started also to understand how powerful genre is
Mm.
actually. Like how you can do amazing films and like say the most complex or difficult things through it as well. Because at first I was very my first like exercises and shorts were very gory and very fun and wild. I see them and oh my god, I would do very crazy things, but then I love that I had that freedom and I was breaking every rule, and then I feel like I started understanding that I could kind of put everything together and do something that was very meaningful for me. So I just feel very lucky that I follow that path, really. Yeah, always grateful for horror. Saved my life.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
I do have a question. What is your what would you say is your favorite punk band? I am curious. Do you have
My
one?
favorite punk band. Maybe I don't know if you heard them, but they're from Chicago, from Pilsen, Los
Okay.
Crudos.
Oh, no.
Los Crudos. Oh, I think you're gonna love them. They're actually quite queer as well, and in
Oh,
the
really?
like they're yeah, Martin Crudo, like the lead. He wow, it's such an amazing band. They're actually Latin American, and it's like way like I maybe it's one of my favorite punk bands, but it's also one of the best punk shows that I've been in my life. I went to a Los Crudos
Oh,
show in
cool.
Tijuana, some like like I don't know, some years ago, like maybe 8 years ago, and it was one of the best punk shows I've been to, because honestly, all the communities in Mexico from different punk scenes came to watch to see the so we were all there. Like we kind of gathered in
Hell yeah, it's like a
Tijuana
big
for this
party.
show, and of course many from the from San Diego and California, like Los Angeles, like a lot of Latin Americans, and it was wild. Like for a moment I thought someone was gonna die. Like it was like this someone is gonna die in this show because it was too wild. Like it was so wild that they could only play like 5 songs and they had to stop because you it was like a sea of crazy people. But it was so
Oh my
fun.
God.
So I would, if you haven't heard them, I really recommend. I think you're gonna love Los Crudos. Yes.
Fuck
Okay.
yeah.
I'm
Okay.
adding this
Yeah.
to my Apple
Yeah.
list. I gotta search them out.
Yeah, and I love X-Ray Specs. I feel that that was my first favorite punk band as
Okay.
well, from London. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah. I love that question. I haven't had that question before.
I'm now following them on Spotify.
I'm a huge
I'm
music
like,
nerd, and so
who is
whenever I
it?
I
find
love
someone,
that. No, I love that. Yeah. I love it.
oh, that's so
Um,
cool.
Okay, well, we're going to go quick commercial break, and then we're going to come back and talk about Michelle's movie pick. And we're back! All right, Michelle, what movie did you bring with you today for us to discuss?
I brought The Elephant Man by David Lynch.
Okay, so I'm going to read a super brief synopsis before we jump in. But in The Elephant Man, a Victorian surgeon rescues a heavily disfigured man who is mistreated while scraping a living as a sideshow freak. Behind his monstrous facade, there is revealed a person of kindness, intelligence, and sophistication.
Yeah, okay. So bring us back. When did you see this movie? How old were you? What about it scared you, and why is this your scarred for life pick?
You know what? Like I had a friend that she's still my friend here in Mexico City. I was in elementary school with her,
Mm-hmm.
and her father was a big cinephile. That's a word in English. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he would play films, crazy films to us that were not for kids. Like I remember watching Wild Strawberries, or like films that I can't believe, like we were 7, but he would just put them there and we would sit with him to watch the films. And so one day he played The Elephant Man for us, and I was like 7 or 8, and we speak
Wow.
about this, my friend and I, saying like it did traumatize us back then, mostly because we had no, of course we were 7, we had no
Mm-hmm.
idea what we were watching, and he was serious and kind of like hermetic. It's not like the kind of dad that he would explain us like what was going on. So we started thinking that the elephant one was really, we were expecting him to be the monster, like it was like
Mm.
we watched the film as it was gonna be a horror film. So I remember being very impressed at first. Honestly, like this is a film that having the memory for the first time of my life of understanding how mean human beings can be, and
Yep.
it broke my heart. I remember we were crying, like it was strong for us because it kind of like, it was the first moment that I realized actually the monster was the fragile, and what was supposed to be the monster was completely the other. Like that's what's so clever of that film, right? So it really, I do remember it as that moment where I realized like actually we can be the monster.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I feel like it transformed me in a way. I do remember The Elephant Man to give me that realization, if that's the word, like that reflection, and I
Mm-hmm.
understanding that. Yes.
Wow. I can't imagine seeing this being 7 years old. Like this is a heavy movie, let alone the kind of the topics that it's dealing with. It's a very heavy film. I can't, like, I was watching, like my movies were released, like Jason or Freddy or that kind of stuff for when I was like 7 or 8 years old, and I don't think I could have handled this movie as a 7-year-old.
I feel like I didn't know how to handle it back then as well. Maybe it wasn't the cleverest thing to for us to watch it like back then, you know. But I do think but it in a sense like it did kind of gave me another filter, you know, in ways. Like I feel like I understood evil in another way, but
Mm.
and like it did broke something, and
Yeah.
yes, yeah.
So I'm curious. Before you watch this movie, what kind of movies were you typically drawn to as a kid?
No, completely other things. Like I
Yeah.
was as a kid, let me think. My parents were very like into Kurosawa, for example.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But I do remember like watching them like some Kurosawa films, but that were not very impressive. Like it was not very like they were light. I didn't understand them. They were just
Right.
like they would pick things that I would. They were not very violent, I guess. But of course, I was also watching Matilda. That I loved
Yeah.
Matilda, and I love the Disney, of course. Like I was like Aladdin was maybe my favorite film for a while when I was a
I
little
love
girl.
that you were watching, kids movies and then Kurosawa movies as a child. So
We
cool. Like your parents were just like, yeah, you can read. You can read the subtitles. Like you're fine.
Yeah, we
You're
had
fine.
weird parents. Like I like some of my first memories that I have watching a Kurosawa film, or maybe that's what I kept of my father. Is one Kurosawa film. I feel like it's called Ishiguro, which is
Yes.
kind of like a painting. It's kind of like you're inside of a painting, right?
Mm.
So and that was
Mm-hmm.
very beautiful actually. Like I was not even like scared or anything about that one, I guess. But
Yeah.
yeah, but the Elephant Man was something that it was hard to digest because the moment where it gets very dark, it's very dark, and
It
yeah.
it's a very dark film. So I'm curious. Being a 7-year-old watching this movie about with some really great special effects, but just the kind of there is an element of, I would say, horror in the way in which they present the Elephant Man initially, John Merrick initially, with like him being in the kind of carnival, and he's like kept chained up, and it is played almost like a horror movie in that regard, and then it sort of starts to peel back the layers. I'm curious what your first thoughts were seeing John Merrick as a kid, if you remember.
That's very clever because I do think that the film is built, of course, in a very intelligent way, in the sense that it makes you be a monster at first,
Hmm.
you know, because they build this whole suspense for a human being in this whole like morbid, terrible expectation. They build such an expectation that you're dying to look at him as
Yeah.
well, which is completely dark. And then
Yeah.
it hits you, and you're scared of him at first and impressed, right? So it's a very moving film because it kind of, of course, the spectator is part of it, like you are part of it, and that's why it's maybe even worse for a kid to watch it. because
Yeah.
because remember the opening. I rewatched it again because I knew we were gonna watch, so I wanted to have it fresh. And the opening scene is maybe the one that most affected me, because it's like this moment where her mother is being attacked by an elephant. Do you
Yep.
remember? And it's very
Yeah.
Hmm.
Lynch-esque because the film is
It's
not so
so
Yes.
Lynch.
Lynch.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
it's different. It's more narrative, right? But that scene is so Lynch, and it's like this like slow motion, and that image of the woman being attacked by the elephant is the one that I have locked in my mind when I watch it as a little kid. Like I was like, no, it was very scary for me.
Yeah.
It's so surreal, and that is, like, as you were saying, like when we think of like Lynchian things, we're not thinking of the Elephant Man in terms of the story, because it's so narrative. It's so weirdly like his most conventional film, but like he kind of bookends it with these surreal moments involving his mom, and
Hmm.
it is terrifying. And I can imagine being a kid and not knowing what you're getting into, and that's the first image is like the kind of superimposed elephants with their eyes, and then her being attacked. It almost looks like she's being ravaged by it. Like there's
Yes.
it's weird visual imagery, and I can't imagine seeing that as a kid and being like, what is going on? You know?
Yes. And I understood later, of course, in life that actually what happened is that the mother died in birth,
Hmm.
in labor, right? But it's kind of like saying like an elephant killed her. It's
Yeah.
very
Yeah.
macabre. It's very macabre, and I do remember honestly because I was a little kid and like reading subtitles, like it was like we were not really understanding, you know. And I
Yeah.
remember being for long moments of the film at the beginning. I was very fearful of the elephant man. I was
Hmm.
really scared
Yeah.
of him, and then when it started to change, when I started seeing him as a victim, it was horrible. It was like because kind of like it makes you be part of it. What I was trying to say,
Yeah.
like you were
Yeah.
part of that for what they're he's being attacked later, right? So it's really it's very maybe the more narrative Lynch film, but it's not less dark, I guess.
No.
Yeah. Well, and I think what I noticed, because this is my first time actually ever seeing this. I'm a huge David Lynch fan, but for some reason this was like one of the only films of his I hadn't seen, which is wild. But it's like the first 30 minutes you don't see him. You either like hear people whispering about him, or you see him you see his shadow as they're presenting him to like the group, the gentleman doctors group. And what I think Lynch does so well is he really makes it obvious that you are staring at this guy. Like as he does the close-ups of all of the men looking at the body, as Anthony Hopkins' character is very scientifically like breaking down this person who is not being treated like a person. Like you really feel this kind of voyeurism that you're participating in. And then when you finally see him, it's when the nurse brings him that food and he's just like in his pajamas on the bed and he's screaming like he's terrified. And you're like, oh, it is it's jarring at first because you're seeing his face for the first time, but at the same time, he's in a position of weakness too. Like, and it's this reveal that isn't necessarily dramatic because it's not like this dramatic music of like, oh my God, his face. It's much more subtle than that. And I love that because I think that removes the spectacle. It's Lynch doing such an incredible job removing the idea of spectacle around the Elephant Man, and that he is a person who deserves just as much love as anyone else. And I think that's what I love about Lynch is I think Lynch has a lot of empathy. And I think it's so easy to see in this because it is, so much the theme. But I think you see that a lot in like Twin Peaks, especially around Laura Palmer's character. Are you a Twin Peaks fan, Michelle?
Yes. I love Twin Peaks. I've been wanting to rewatch the whole thing, actually. Yes.
So Terry's watching it right now. I won't spoil anything, but like, we get introduced at the beginning to like a girl wrapped in plastic, another dead girl on a beach. But then as the series unfolds, you learn about her. And then obviously, Fire Walk with Me, like you learn so much more about her and you develop this empathy towards
completely
her.
She's a complete human being, right? Like
exactly.
even if she's not there, you can see many aspects of her life as a whole human being. Like it's very hard to judge her as many of those narratives with like rebellious women that deserve what happened to them, like there's like a very toxic. That's very true. And I do think like even like I love how we're talking about how David Lynch, because there's like a concept of well, at least I have built like this concept around his work that is kind of charged with evil or like cruelness. But honestly, I do think like there's like a very loving layer in many of his works, right?
I think so. And I think a lot of these people in his movies are people who are just trying to find some kind of kindness in the world. And there's not a lot of kindness in the world. And I think there's a lot of that in his work. And I think it might be harder to see because, again, it's so surreal and it's weird. And his style of filmmaking is so incredibly unique and bizarre. But I do think, like, it is incredibly empathetic work if you look at it. Like, and I love that about him because he's such a weirdo. But I think, especially him as a person that you see on the internet, like, I think he just wants people to love each other. And I love that about him. And I think this movie is so that in a really smart way. And again, that he makes us think about monstrosity. And then he's like, ooh, but especially in 1980. Yeah, especially in 1980. Because, like, you know, I think if someone who did not, like, know about David Lynch or anything would watch this now and they'd be like, oh my god, like, this is so simplistic. But it's like, no, actually, well, one, it's not. But two, like, in 1980, having a narrative like this that is, like, very much confronting and not trying to be ableist and, like, not trying to be like, wow, look at the disabled person, look at him go. I think, like, this is such a special movie.
Yes, it's very radical. It's very, I'm also impressed by it being his second feature.
After Eraserhead, I love the comparison of Eraserhead and The Elephant Man. Incredible. Like,
yes.
Amazing.
Yeah, but you can feel like, of course, he was getting like these offers and this attention, right, after Eraserhead, but he still managed to make a great film and so in his own kind of dark narrative, I guess, like you can see I mean, it's an amazing film, but you can see that Lynchian heart, and like, honestly, it's a perfect film. Like come on, like, the closing is perfect. It's perfect. And I have to say that my memory as a child was that he passed away in the lynching, in the you know, in the scene, in the scene of the horrible scene in the subway, you know. Oh my god, that scene, it's terrifying. Or maybe I even stopped watching it then. Because I built for a long time the idea that he was killed by the mass of people.
Wow.
Oh, shit.
Yes, but now that I watch it again and all, I realize, like, no, it's such a beautiful closing of a film.
Like, he finally has agency at the end of the movie.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
I was not familiar with David Lynch's work very much. I'd never watched anything of his except for Dune. Dune was my only, for the longest time, the only Lynch film I had seen was Dune.
I love that was your only Lynch movie.
That's very cool. That's very cool. I love that.
Wild. Because my mom was a huge Dune fan. And so my parents had rented it one night and I watched it and I was like, what is going on with this? Like, my kid's mind was like not able to, I think, fully put together everything that was happening in that movie. Because it's a
not even your adult brain can really put together what's happening. He tried. He really tried, but it's a lot.
But what's interesting is that, like, last year, so one of my writer friends, Joe Lipsett, he and I we're doing this podcast and it's going to launch next month. But like, it's where we're talking about David Lynch films and David Cronenberg films, because I am not hugely familiar with either of their work except for like maybe one or two pieces. And so we're going from the start of both of their careers. And so this is the second time in like 6 months that I've seen Elephant Man, because I watched Eraserhead for the first time, and then we watched The Elephant Man back in September, I think it was.
Oh, right.
And I'm like, so I'm working my way through his filmography, and what an amazing creator. And what I love about this movie, and what I love about at least the early Lynch, I'm not sure, because again, we're only up to Twin Peaks. We just started doing Twin Peaks in our recordings, but like his obsession with industrialism, there's like a lot of focuses on factories, and this, because like in Eraserhead, it's almost like a post-industrial world where everything is like just gross buildings and smokestacks and just horrid. And there's that image here. There's a lot of imagery here in this movie where it's like the men are being injured by machines. There's like the big soot stacks coming up out of like the chimneys. There's a lot of focus on that kind of industrial revolution type feel to it. And so it's interesting for me to watch this movie as sort of like seeing, because I think a lot of people see this as sort of like, this one in Dune is sort of like an outlier of his movies, because it's not the sort of weird kind of Eraserhead or Blue Velvet or Twin Peaks-esque type stuff. But there is a lot of visual artistry that is going into this that is so definitely Lynch. And so it's interesting to me to kind of start to go through his career from the very beginning and sort of piece together what makes David Lynch tick. And this movie, This movie, I think, is just it's so fantastic. It's so depressingly sad. I was watching it again to prepare for this, and I started crying at the one scene where John Merrick goes to meet I am blanking on the name, Trevs. I'm not sure how to pronounce his last name.
Treves, because I thought he was called Jeeves. I thought he was Jeeves, and I was like,
okay.
Oh my God.
Where he goes to meet Frederick's wife, and they have like tea, and he's sitting there.
I did this part too.
Me too.
I wrote down, why am I crying? And I'm just like sobbing. Sorry, Terry. Yeah. Sorry.
No, I'm glad that I'm not alone, because it's like this first moment of pure humanity that is being, because like up until this moment, everyone is treating him as a spectacle, even Freddy. Like I love it later on in the movie, he kind of questions his own.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yes.
Yeah. But like before that, it's whether he's being showed off to crowds that are paying for a freak show, or he is, being stripped and paraded in front of all these scientific minds, and everyone thinks he's an imbecile. Everyone thinks that he is, just not there, that he is just a mass of flesh, almost, is how they kind of treat him. And there's this moment where he's sitting down with Freddy and his wife, and it's like she starts to like see him for who he is, and the line where he's like saying that his mother was so beautiful, and she must have been so ashamed of him, almost, because of how he looks. And her line of, you could see just on her face, just like it crushing her, and then her saying that there's no way that his mom would be ashamed of him. And it's just like, oh
yes,
my
for
God.
being such a loving man. I know, it's beautiful. And when he says that, if only she could see me now, spending time with such good friends. Oh my God. No, it's too like, and I was reading, because I love this conversation, guys, because it made me study too, and how it was John Hurt, the actor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how much he had to do with little, because the prosthetics were like taking all over, right? And with like the way he was just delivering the lines and very little movements, it was so much like it's really a fantastic performance as well.
And like, it's just they're they're giving him access to their lives. It's just in such a small way. Like, oh, we're just showing him family pictures, and he's just like, your family is so like your faces are so noble, and they're like, wow, I thought the same thing. And he's just like being so incredibly kind about their family, and just looking at the pictures, and he's like, I've never had friends before, and like, I wish you could see me with friends. And it's just like, so something that, and again, like we take for granted, and he is just like, I'm finally just getting to go to sit at a friend's house and talk and not have to be
beautiful.
Laughed at and gawked at. Like, I am just being treated like an equal that can just sit down and have tea and look at photos. And I can tell you, I have a mom, like I had a mom too, and like I have a picture of her, because like Freddie's like, oh yeah, I want to see your mom. Like, what? And was just like, oh, a study part. But then he's like, she isn't around, and I want to be good for her.
Yeah,
I've tried so hard to be good, and that moment right there, I just started crying. I was like, I'm over. I can't.
I know, it's really heartbreaking I'm sorry, guys, I put you into the heartbreaking.
No, I love it. Well, I mean, like, I just think, like, this is going to sound so cheesy, sorry, but, like, we need more empathy now more than ever, you know what I mean? And this is a movie, like, while that is very traumatizing to see as a child, like, it showed you empathy in a way that you probably had never seen it before. Like, it kind of showed you.
And maybe I did understand. It's kind of similar to Frankenstein in the sense that Frankenstein makes you cry as well, right? Like when you understand that actually the monster could be the other side, and you could always be in that other side. That's something that I think like everyone should be, like discussing since we're kids. Maybe it's important to see how we have that potential as well. It was traumatizing, but on the other hand, I do think like that moment as a kid, of understanding like, oh, the other ones are the ones that are terrible, like especially being in school, where you're surrounded by bullies and like
Yeah.
that, like the whole thing, like it's really well crafted in the sense that it turns the gaze, and
It
yeah,
does, yeah. And Mary Beth, you said something that just sort of like I didn't even realize it until you were talking about it. Is when Freddie's like, "Oh yeah, I want to see your mom too," and I just realized as you were talking, no one's really asked him. No one's really asked him
Nope.
at all of what he's thinking. Because like in the beginning, we see him and he doesn't talk. He just has the sort of like wheezy breath that we hear, but no one is asking him how he feels or anything about him. Like I would think that if you're talking with this man and you're curious, you would be like, "Do you know who your mom was? Who is your mom? Do you have anything about it?" But it hasn't come up until this very
yeah,
moment, and it's this moment of what I think is so powerful about this movie is that it's sort of like the idea of giving humanity to get humanity, because he's perceived initially as a monster, and so he says how he doesn't talk, and because Freddy's like, why didn't you talk to him, and he's like, because I was scared, because I've been seen as a monster for so long, is basically what he's saying. And it's by the time that people are showing empathy and humanity towards him that he is able to come out of his shell and show
yeah,
the world just how intelligent and how kind and how much of a wonderful person there is hiding behind what people see as monstrous. And it just the way that Lynch sort of peels back that layer is just it's so powerful to
yeah.
watch.
And you know what? I feel like for the character of Anthony Hopkins as well, right? Because
Hmm.
we're kind of looking at the film through his eyes, right?
Yeah.
Like he's a loving man, but for a moment he doubts if he's also a monster,
Yes.
right? Like that's why I think that scene is so powerful. Like when he's at night and he can't sleep and he's asking like, "Am I the same as
Hmm.
the abuser?" Right? And that moment, I feel like that's when he really becomes the most loving, like the most empathic, because
Yeah.
he's also accepting these other sides of himself of like, from where am I approaching him, John Merrick, from what aspect, like, yes, because also it's very violent when he's like at the beginning when he takes him to the university or like the to
Hmm.
the scientifics. It's such a violent scene, right? And
Yeah.
he presents that he's presented only by his shadow. Remember, that's very
Yeah.
it's very tough. And you see the like actually I feel like the main character is actually Anthony Hopkins, right? Because and we're kind of
Hmm.
like we're taking his hand throughout the process of from where do we look to John Merrick, right? And he also passes through the process of having a terrible approach to this other human being, right? And but that change is beautiful in in
It
in that
is.
in that also in that character as well.
Well, and I
Yeah,
also love that Lynch never really shows us Merrick's full body unclothed. Because, we hear about him being covered in tumors and like he, one of his genitals, they make a very big point of his genitals are not affected at all. But like they never try to make him a spectacle. We see him like in clothes and we obviously see his head, but again, we're never like, and there's a little bit at the end where you kind of see him partially naked when he's getting abused again. But again, his body isn't made to be a spectacle. He is like the only part that is really a spectacle is when you see the shadow. But again, like it's just the shadow. We're not seeing it. We're just seeing the outline. And I think that is something I'm just not thinking about how like that is such an important choice to like not have a scene where like you walk in on him getting dressed and he's naked and you see his body covered in stuff, but instead of just like he's a person. He just looks a little bit different, but he's a
yeah,
person. I think that is again like shows the empathy and the intelligence of Lynch here and trying to really like make us understand how we look at people in the world really, because I mean we see I agree that Treves is the main character, but I also think there's interesting times where we switch to Merrick's perspective, especially when
that's
he's
true.
like when he is either walking by himself through the hospital or when he's making the cathedral out of paper and
Mm.
how he is like
Yeah,
seeing the world and trying to recreate it for himself. And it's like we're seeing the world a little bit through his eyes. And I think that is really interesting about how he is now, his perspective on the world is also changing too, because I think he's seeing that not all people are cruel as well.
I
in
feel
a
like
way.
you just touch on a point that is very interesting in the film, because you kind of they kind of present David Lynch presents this character as the shadow, as a concept more than what he really is, right? Like little by little,
Yeah.
like he talks
Yeah.
about like how the world
Yeah.
sees only one aspect of this person, which is the terrible thing that the mind does, no? That we want to lock everyone in one concept that we have, right? And then
Right.
it's very beautiful how you say, like, we discovered how much more is behind that. And in that way, that's so beautiful, the whole thing with the cathedral, that he only sees
Yeah.
the
The
little,
spire.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah, and then he builds the other whole thing. So that's, I mean, I just understood that thanks to this conversation. But it's beautiful because he creates something amazing out of only being able to look at a little part of that. And that's the whole point of the film.
Yeah, well,
Maybe.
I'm starting to realize this too. But the thing that I've been like thinking about, and I think this conversation has sort of like melded together, is this idea of, because when in the beginning, when he is like locked up and he is seen as this other, he acts out as if he is a monster that everyone else sees him in. But the moment people start to see him as a human being, and he starts to like see how people live, like I love the again, going back to the scene with Freddie and his wife, where he notices on the mantle there's all these pictures of family and there's all this kind of stuff, and so then he starts to see, oh, this is humanity. People are showing me what it means to be human. And then all of a sudden he's decorating his room with pictures of, he has Mrs. Kendall, the actress that I want to talk about her too, because I love her. But she comes and he has her picture up. He starts making pictures of other people up there. So he starts making his room a home. Whereas before he was like a shadow of a person, and he was living a shadowy existence because people saw him as not human. But as he started to become more human and he starts to like embrace it, people start to see past the kind of physical deformities and seeing him as the human that he is. And so it has this interesting trajectory through it, where it's like visual as well as narrative, kind of showing the change of like how important empathy is, and how being empathetic toward other people makes both you and them more human, in a way, as cheesy as that might sound. But it's I don't know, it's so fascinating.
I know, it's very fascinating. Yeah, because like that's true. Like he embraces the same gaze that people are giving to him at the beginning, because like
Hmm.
they're not giving him any other chance to show any other of the
Right.
aspect, like any aspect of what he really is, right? And it only comes with love. Yeah, I know it sounds cheesy, but it only comes with love and empathy that is able to become who he is really. And yeah, it's very profound film actually.
It really is. It's a lot
Yeah,
more than I even was giving it credit for until we had this conversation, honestly. But
yeah,
okay, Mrs. Kendall, her scene, she is this famous actress. She comes, she meets him, and they do a line from Romeo and Juliet, and it's so, I don't know, it's so touching. And I feel like there's so many moments where this movie could step over bounds and become maudlin, or like, a little cheesy, or a bit too much, or I'm not even sure what the right word is. But I feel like there's so much restraint here that kind of, it comes up to this line, but then he kind of pulls it back. But Mrs. Kendall, played by Anne Bancroft, who is phenomenal in this, I love that scene so much.
Well, and I was like super anxious, like, oh my god, she's gonna laugh at him, she's gonna like force herself on him in some weird, like it. I was like thinking of Edward Scissorhand vibes of like the
Oh,
creepy neighbor who like forces herself on him, and I was like, oh no, because
yeah,
a lot of this movie had me very tense, like. And there's obviously the really awful climax at the end where he's being attacked by people, but like I was on edge of like, what fucking horrible thing are people going to do to him now? But she's one of the first people. Well, and again, because we're introduced to her reading the newspaper about it, and I'm like, oh god, is she like collecting quick weirdos to look
Right.
like to tell people she saw? But that moment is very sweet in a way that I was very surprised by, and I think that. It's interesting. I was so surprised by her kindness. And I think that maybe Lynch is playing with that as well. Of like, I think he knows what he's doing and being like, ooh, what is this woman going to do? What are her intentions? And then she like gives him a copy of Romeo and Juliet and gives him a sweet kiss on the cheek. And he's like, see, you assumed the worst in people. And it's like,
yeah.
fuck, you're right. Like, I really did assume the worst in people right now, like, very much so.
Yeah, it's actually like it's very clever because it's kind of like it builds a lot of suspense, right? Because we're fearing for the character. And then, like, I mean, I'm sorry, but have you watched The Last of Us? Are you watching it, or you don't care about it?
Yes.
Oh my
I
God,
love.
I'm sorry because this just reminded me to the third episode where I was always expecting. I'm sorry, but I was always expecting. It's just such a masterpiece, right? But we were always expecting, right, that something terrible was gonna happen, that you couldn't trust the other one, and it's just so fantastic when that doesn't happen, right?
Yes.
Well, talk about agency of characters. Like, again, I think that it's like, it just goes back to the end of like Lynch making sure that Merrick does have agency eventually. And that, like, in The Last of Us, episode 3, they have, I'm gonna cry, they have agency in their deaths. And I think there's something, I just think, like, the power of giving characters that we don't see have this kind of agency is so important. Like, a lot of the time we see gay people dying on screen, like, in tragic ways, but sorry, spoilers for Last of Us, but, like, it is so much more than that. And then in here, I mean, jumping to the end, sorry, Terry, sorry. Like, we see him.
No, but it's very true.
Like, he has the most magical night of his life, and she takes him to this beautiful play, and people are applauding, and they're looking at him as a person, and then he's able to kind of die. What is he? Because I've gained myself. He said, I've gained myself. And I was like, it's over. I'm done. I'm over. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I never want to watch it again because I'm going to cry a million times. But
I agree. Wow, I love this. It was this is really a very good exploration. I love like the similarity we found with that episode. That's
right. Like,
and yes, and it has to do with like more yeah. Sorry if it sounds very like we can be very cheesy here, but
of course.
It's really poetic in the sense that in both cases there's like an agency to rest. Like I can finally rest more than death. It's just like I can let go, and that's amazing. Like I can really fully trust, and that's beautiful.
Well, especially because we see him get like, these horrible people like the horrible guard is like taking people to see him, bringing women there, like they pour liquor down his throat, they beat him up, and then they kidnap him and sell him again. And you're like, oh, Jesus Christ, we're getting back to the tragedy of this whole thing. And while we have that for a bit, we do see him escaping the freak show, like that.
Oh my God,
he's no longer in England.
Such a powerful scene, right? Sorry for interrupting, but it's such a powerful scene, that one, where they collectively set him free. It's beautiful. It's very radical, I guess.
Exactly, because like they throw him in the cage with the monkeys, and then all of the other circus freaks are like, no, we're getting the fuck out of here. Like, this is disgusting. And they get him out, and they put him on a boat, and they're like, luck. We are the people in the world that need the luck. And he's able to travel back to London, and we have that really terrifying moment where he goes, like the known moment of, I am not an animal, I'm a human being, I am a man. Like, it's like this, like, him finally, like, trying to reclaim something in front of strangers of, like, I'm not a fucking animal. And it's just, like, again, like, John Hurt's performance and his ability to really convey things with his voice so well. Because, again, like, there's not a lot of facial expressions, but his ability to speak his lines with so much emotion is just, like...
Yeah, that scene is a masterpiece, really. It's really terrifying. And honestly, it's so built in a sense that is the other's gaze that is the monster. It's really scary, right? Like the way, like actually, like since the beginning, right? Like every scene, every collective scene, or like masses, like when the person, like when there's not one gaze that is like a collective gaze. That's like it feels very monstrous, right? And very
the mob
evil
mentality, like again, like thinking of
mob.
Thinking of Frankenstein in both instances where they mob the hospital, but then also when he's getting mobbed at the train station, all because some fucking kid is shooting spitballs at him and saying, oh, I missed her, why is your head so big? And he is just trying so hard to be like, like not headphones, like the equivalent of like headphones on, head down, like don't look at anybody. And then, it spirals out of control when he accidentally knocks a girl over, and it's just these people immediately like ripping off the hood that he wears and all this stuff. And it's so, I was worried that was going to be the ending, but then I saw there was like more time left. I was like, oh, thank God. I was like, are we really going to end on this depressing note of this guy being so close to being home? Like, he finally has a home, and he's not going to get back to it, but he does. And that's why I was like, okay, cool. So we still have a little bit of like a happier... Look, I love a good nihilistic movie, but this is not one that I wanted to be.
No. Like, this one couldn't take it down. It would have been terrible.
No, absolutely not.
I'm going to apologize in advance because I went looking to see if I could find out information about the real John Merrick. And what makes me really sad, and I'm sorry I'm going to bring this down a bit, but what makes me really sad is that the real John Merrick, even after death, is being seen as a curiosity in the medical field because his bones were bleached and put on display in the University of London's medical school. Some of his flesh was saved for medical study, and the rest of his remains was buried in an unknown grave. And it wasn't until 2019, because I found this article on history.com, where a biographer of Merrick says she found where the rest of his remains were buried. And he was probably buried. There's no definite answer to this because it's an unmarked grave, but it sounds like he was buried in the same cemetery as Mary Ann Polly Nichols and Catherine Kate Eddowes, who were two of the women Jack the Ripper killed. And so he's buried.
Way. Really?
So he's buried in this cemetery, and it's what's called a common grave, where there are people below him and people above him. So he's not on his own. And it's just whatever tissue is not being studied. And it's so sad when you think about that, because we have throughout this whole movie, we have him being picked apart by either the kind of freak show crowd or the scientific community. And it's sad. And again, that's why I'm sorry for bringing this down, but it's sad to me that after his death, he's still being looked at as a medical curiosity and not as a human being. And that just meant that, like, reading that final article on history.com just like kind of broke my heart all over again, because it sort of deflates what the movie is trying to establish. And it just makes me so angry and so sad.
I know. It's impressive, like how the film didn't how the film didn't help to change that, like it's such a clear reflection. I have to add something that I read recently, and it was before, like a couple months ago. I worked in a TV show where I was kind of inspired by what's his name? The writer. Oh my God, sorry. It's a French writer in the style of Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote the short story The Severed Hand. Maupassant.
Okay.
Do you know? Yes.
Yeah.
He was in the same hospital as the Elephant Man, as John Merrick. Yes, and they were very close friends, like best friends, apparently. Like they would gather. Like I would send you what I found, but they would gather every night, like just to talk. And he was like one of his best friends for a long time. Maupassant was like in the hospital due to psychiatric issues. And I think that's beautiful. I just wanted to say, like, I feel like I'm sure he had amazing people around as well that were there for him. And I feel like that's kind of like, there were people that were able to not be in that other horrible side, like that is the mob, I guess, that we call it here, the mob. Yeah.
The other thing that surprised me as I was looking into this movie is that this was produced by Mel Brooks, and he like purposefully left his name off of the kind of the production part of it because he didn't want people to think it was going to be a comedy. And I just think that it's so interesting that the person that we know for, Dracula Dead and Loving It, or Young Frankenstein, or Blazing Saddles is producing this very empathetic, very serious movie. And he has like the foresight to realize that if his name was attached to it, people would look at as a comedy. And
Wow.
I think that's so fascinating. And it's because of
Yes.
not Elephant Man, Eraserhead that this all came to be, because I guess Mel Brooks' assistant was a huge fan of Eraserhead and showed it to him, and he fell in love with it. And that's kind of how this all came to be.
That's an amazing story. I
It's
love
so
I love
that.
that
cool.
Mel Brooks loved Eraserhead.
Right,
Like, that to
right?
me is incredible. That Mel Brooks
Yeah.
loved Eraserhead. Like,
Yeah.
amazing.
Talent
That's
recognizing
fantastic.
talent.
I know. We could probably talk about this movie for hours and hours, but should we wrap up and give this a rating out of 5, Terry?
Sounds good.
All right, Terry, how many Lynchian masterpieces out of 5 do you give The Elephant Man?
I mean, it's in the rating. It's funny when I watched this back in September, I was thinking that this is a really good movie, and I was like, if I had to assign a score back then, it would have been somewhere between a 4 and a 4.5. But as I'm having this conversation now, and I rewatched it, and I could appreciate it more on like just in an enjoyment. Enjoyment might be a strong word, but I did enjoy it, although it's not a very enjoyable subject matter, if that makes sense. But as I'm watching this, and I started to like realize just how empathetic, how moving, and how powerful it is that the story kind of presents one thing and then peels back the layers and kind of shows both the horror and the humanity within the viewer of it. It's so well done. I have to give it 5. What about you, Mary Beth?
It's a 5 for me. I mean, this is the movie this is the movie that forced the Academy to make an award for Best Makeup at the Academy Awards, since there was no category for it, and it was such an incredible piece of work to make John Hurt look like that. And, so applause for that. But also, just like I've talked about, this is such a beautiful look at empathy, and it's not a cheesy kind of rumination on like, be kind to people. It's Lynch. So it has like, whiffs of that, but it's also very him. It's got this beautiful it's filmed beautifully in black and white. It has like this kind of like a few surreal elements, but it's just like, I think if you watch his other films and are like, what the hell is this guy doing? Watch The Elephant Man and really see like Lynch is deeply empathetic and wants people to understand like how to love other people and just like extend human decency to people. And I love Lynch. I love this movie, and I'm so glad that I got to watch it finally. Michelle, you have the final word. How many Lynchian masterpieces out of 5 do you give The Elephant Man?
Honestly, I agree with Terry in the sense that before, I guess, when I started seeing the other David Lynch films and all, I would have said 4 because I kind of love like all the craziness that there's in the other ones. But now after this talk and after watching it again, I do relate to it in a way much profound way that I thought. And I think like I'm very glad I picked this film because I feel like it really goes along with so much of what I think it's important in filmmaking and in many ways. So I definitely a 5. Yeah.
Hell yeah.
I love it even more now.
Oh. Well, thank you so much for joining us and talking about your movie and The Elephant Man. This was such a great conversation. Are you on social media? If you are, where can our listeners find you? Otherwise, what do you have you'd like to talk about? The floor is yours. If you have things you can share, if you want to talk about where your movie's at and all that kind of stuff.
Yes, thank you so much. My social media is Garza Cervera.
Okay.
And I am in Twitter and in Instagram. You can see there like all about what's going on with Huesera, the Bone Woman. In the US, you can find it in VOD, and in May it's gonna be available in Shudder. So that's exciting. And if you're in Mexico right now, it's in cinemas, in theaters. So hoping for more weeks there. And in Canada, I think it's gonna release soon as well. So please be like you can see in my social media.
Hell yeah.
Hell yeah. So listeners, you've heard from us, but we want to hear from you. What was your experience with The Elephant Man? You can send us an email at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us directly on Twitter. I am at MB McAndrews.
And I'm at Gaily Dreadful.
And of course, don't forget to follow the podcast on Twitter at Scarred Podcast.
And please don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe. And if you want to help support us, we do have a Patreon.
Thank you to Eric Power for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you everyone for listening. Please stay safe out there. But most importantly, stay creepy.
And until next time.